Hi, everyone. I'm Lori Bloom, co-founder of Gracefully Graying. Welcome to Gracefully Graying Live. We are connecting you to information and resources in Michigan and beyond to help you create and maintain a productive and vibrant life as we are all gracefully graying. And as always, a thanks to our sponsors. Enjoy the live stream.
Welcome to Gracefully Graying. I am your host, Attorney Henry Gornvine. This Friday, January 20th, is Holocaust Remembrance Day. We are going through some very traumatic times with a very frightening rise in anti-Semitism. So it's imperative that we never let a Holocaust happen again and that we never forget what happened. Today on Gracefully Graying, I am pleased to welcome as my guest Fran Parker, who is the daughter of Holocaust survivors. Fran, welcome to Gracefully Graying. Fran, tell us about your background.
I guess the background with my parents, both my parents were Holocaust survivors. They were both from Czechoslovakia, where my dad was from. It was called Mukasheva and Munkac, and today that's Ukraine. Where my mother was from was called Yezino, and today that's Slovakia.
What was it like being the daughter of Holocaust survivors? How did that impact upon your childhood and growing up?
Well, first of all, there was always a fear. There was always a fear of another doom. There was always a fear that Hitler was going to get me too. I grew up without very many aunts, uncles, cousins, or grandparents. I never met a grandparent. I didn't even see pictures of them because they were all destroyed. And so growing up without any of that, my parents always felt sorry for us. So my mother would befriend old people all the time and tell us that they were our grandparents. She was always looking for grandparents for us. And there was that fear. My dad, whenever we would try to make plans to go anywhere, do anything, and he says, if we should be around then. You know, he always acted like you can't plan very much for the future because you didn't know that you had a future. Whenever we had like Jewish holidays, Passover, I had an uncle, and my dad and uncle would just tell their stories about the Holocaust, the imprisonment, Mengele. They would just tell their stories, and they were both trying to compete with one another. So it wasn't like a fairy tale childhood that other children may have. It was a childhood of, you know, what our parents went through. My parents spoke. There were families where parents never spoke. My parents spoke a lot. They had nightmares. We were aware of it. And I think when you grow up as a child of Holocaust survivors, you grow up with an increased sensitivity to your parents. You want to make them proud. You want to make them happy. You want to kind of undo the Holocaust for them by making their life great here. Another hard part of being a child of Holocaust survivors is we could never really show any emotions. You couldn't be depressed. You couldn't show anxiety because my parents would always say, you live in America. America is the land of the free. You're so lucky that you're being raised in America. And so they made us like we were so lucky to be in America that we couldn't show or exhibit any kind of feelings. So we didn't.
What about, do you think this helped your decision to become a psychologist?
Of course.
And I know you wrote your PhD thesis on the dominant attitudes of adult children of Holocaust survivors towards their parents.
Correct? Yes, I did.
What did you tell us about your mother's life and what she told to people and to you over the years?
My mother's life, I can start with, her parents had 6 children. There were 5 girls and 1 boy, and one of the sisters died at the age of 2. I think it was pneumonia. And then my mother was the last born, and I think between the oldest and her was maybe 16 years. So she was the baby of the family. Her mother was a business owner. They had a spa in the Carpathian Mountains, and they had a beer garden. which was like a pub at their home. Her father was the builder of the city. He built all the homes, and he was the storyteller of the city. They were the only Jews in their city. And so my mother couldn't go to public schools. She went to Greco-Orthodox schools because there were no public schools around, and they were the only Jewish family. And my mom said growing up, kids would say to her, "You killed Jesus." So my mother would go to her parents and say, "Why did we kill Jesus?" And her parents would say, "You never killed Jesus." They would try to explain to her that some religions look at it that way. My mother didn't identify strongly as Jewish because she was in Greco-Orthodox. Those were the only prayers she knew, and those were the people she knew. So she came from a background where her grandmother, Sarah, lived with them. Her grandmother helped raise her because her mother was always working. There were only a couple kids at home with her. When my mother was a teenager, her brother came to America. Her sisters all stayed, and her sisters got married, and they all had children. So when they went to concentration camp, she had all these nieces and nephews. And my mom's father, my mom had a great childhood, she said. She was very loved, and she knew it. And her father always told her, "You can do whatever you want." And I guess he tried to tell her, "You need to survive so you can tell our story one day." I guess he didn't really think he was going to. And then they went to Auschwitz, and she was maybe 19, 20 years old. She had started college in a nearby city. She had a fiance. She was a guy named Martin Ehrenheit, who she was supposed to marry. And then they go to concentration camp, and they go to Auschwitz. And they had two lines, as everybody knows, where you go through Mengele. And my mother was because her sisters were carrying children, they all went with her parents and her grandmother. So she was by herself. And she said one of the things about the people in the concentration camps, they all hung out with their family. They had sisters, they had cousins, and she was really virtually alone. And she was in line at Auschwitz, where they give you a number. And there was a girl by the last name of Greenberger, just like her, that was behind her, and all of her family was in front of my mother. So she said to my mother, "Please change papers with me. I want to be with my family." So my mother did. So my mother went from being in front of her, my mother went behind her, and I think her name was Viola. So, and they had the same birth date, but their birth date was 4 years apart. So when my mother came to America, she came with the other person's birth date, not her own. And so then my mother went through the camps, and she relied heavily on intuition. And she really told me that she always felt she was going to make it. She really didn't think she was going to die. She just had a feeling she was going to make it. And when they were at Auschwitz and they were going to a work camp somewhere else, they were taking like cattle cars, trains. And there were like 4 or 5 trains, and they tried to get my mother, and she ran with a group of 5 women. They always hung out together. And my mother had this terrible feeling not to go into that train. So she grabbed a few of her friends and says, "We can't go there. We got to run to the back car." So a few of them went with her. And as soon as they got started, poles fell on the 2 trains ahead, and all the girls were killed. So she really believed her intuition was going to guide her, and she always did that. And I don't know, what else did you want me to tell you about her?
Well, she was at different camps, is that correct?
Yes, she went from Auschwitz, they had their marching in the night, and they were freezing and all of that. They went to a couple work camps, and my mother did buildings in the work camps. She was a laborer. And I think one of the reasons she survived, or they chose her, was she was blonde hair, blue-eyed, and she was robust. She had big breasts, and she was like, a stark looking woman. She wasn't fat, but she wasn't like a weak looking woman. So they had her building buildings. They had her doing all this work detail. And eventually, they transferred her to Bergen-Belsen. So she went from Poland to Germany. And it was on trains and marches. And I don't know exactly how it happened. And Bergen-Belsen I think she was there for about 4 months. And she said the stench was awful. She told me at least in Auschwitz, she had latrines, a place to pee, to go to the bathroom in the middle of the floor. They called them the latrines. And she was in Bergen-Belsen too, she told me. I visited the place she was at and I saw where she slept when I went to Auschwitz. She said that when they went to Bergen-Belsen, there were no toilets. They just went anywhere on the floor that they could go. And she said it was filthy, it was dirty, there were dead bodies everywhere. It was horrible. And that's where she met Anne Frank. She called her Anne Frank. And Anne Frank and my mother communicated in German to each other. And Anne was a bit younger than my mother. And she also met Margot, her sister. And within days, Margot died of typhus. Anne had typhus, and Anne did not want to succumb to death. My mother said that Anne's eyes were unforgettable, that Anne was unforgettable. She never saw anybody that fought so hard to live. So my mother helped her get her head up so she could eat. And she used every bit of strength she had in her to eat something. And my mom was always helping her. And then one day she died. And when she died, my mother, along with the other girls, they made them take the bodies and dump them into the mass graves, And my mother said about 10 days after Anne Frank died, my mother already had typhus at that point. The British soldiers came. So when the British soldiers came, my mother was sick. My mother had typhus. She was holding on. She was still trying to eat like Anne Frank had done. And then when they finally did liberate her, she was very ill. So they made a makeshift hospital at Bergen-Belsen. And then eventually she was sent to a hospital. She was liberated April 15th, 1945. And she was at the hospital in Germany till June of 1945. So she could leave.
Now, your mother ended up living for a while in California. And what did she do to try to pass on her experience so that the world would never forget?
Well, my mom went to California when she was in her 60s, actually. She moved there with my dad. I had two brothers in California. And my mother volunteered at the Tolerance Center. It was in Palm Desert, California. And my mother would never forget, that was very important to her. She educated about the Holocaust. She was a major speaker of the Tolerance Center. She spoke in schools. She was even invited to speak at country clubs, in Rancho Mirage. She was a speaker for about, I would say, 15 to 20 years. And she was in California until 2016 or the end of 2015. And she spoke to middle school kids. She didn't speak to elementary school. I think she just did middle school and high school. And the kids were Hispanic, Native American. There's a big Native American presence in Palm Springs. And she spoke to the African American kids. So she spoke to minority students.
Now, you're wearing something that was your mother's. Is that correct? On your head?
My mom was a bingo player, and she was a champion of bingo at the Avalon Assisted Living. And she won more things than you could imagine. Her whole room was filled with all of her prizes. And she had very long hair, about the same as mine, and it was silver, and it was like wavy. And the African-American girls loved doing her hair. They would put braids all over her head. She wore headbands all the time. She got her hair done. She got her nails done up until the end. My sister and I, when we went to clean out the room, we each took a couple of her headbands, and the rest of the headbands went to the caregivers there. She had about a dozen.
Fran, are there a couple of letters from students that you can share with us before we sign?
Of course. My mother got 100 letters in all. So there were so many. So I'm going to share a couple here. Here's one that said, "Dear Viola Klein, it's a pleasure to meet someone like you. I couldn't find an exact word to describe your story. I am very sorry about what just happened. I wish there's no such thing about the Holocaust and that there were no racists. I sometimes feel what you felt when you were in Germany. Some people are hating you because of your race. I did get few hates, but a lot of bullying. I sometimes feel like the world is better without me. But when I heard your story, that inspired me. No matter how hard your life is, be brave and always believe that you're going to get through all of this. I want to say thanks for telling us your story. I'm very honored to hear it. I wish it won't ever happen again. That's one. And you want me to do one more letter?
One more letter, and then we're going to
Okay.
sign off.
Thank you so much for coming to our school. It meant a lot to me. I'm very interested in the Holocaust. So when you came to talk to us, I was over the moon excited. I'm very sorry you had to go through that. Thank God you made it. I never knew that someone I had known for very little time would have such a big impact on my life. I cried while you were talking to us. The thought of such a nice lady being in prison because of what her ethnicity was, where she came from, made me so sad. I really do hope your life has become much better since then. You're such a strong person. I wish to be like you. I wish to be like you. After you were done talking, I got in line to give you a hug. I don't know why, but when I hugged you, I felt so sorry, but at the same time, so happy that you can still be here with us. Thank you for coming.
Fran, you can be very proud of your mother. She lived a very full and rich life, and she survived some of the greatest tragedies and horrors of mankind. And I really appreciate you sharing this with us, and we're out of time. I want to thank our viewers for watching this important segment of Gracefully Graying, and I want to thank our sponsors. And again, remember that January 20th is Holocaust Remembrance Day. Thank you.
Thank you.